Today we will have a look at the NVA, the Nationale Volksarmee, which was the National People's Army of East Germany. Coming up. Hi and welcome to another East Germany Investigated video. After World War II ended, it was decided that Germany must never have an army again. This was part of the complete disarmament and demilitarization of Germany, decided by the Allied powers at the Potsdam Conference in August 1945. After the war that had brought so much misery and had cost so many lives, all things military were to be rejected. No one in or outside of Germany could imagine that there could ever be German armed forces again. But things turned out differently. In the first few years after the war, tensions between East and West increased. In 1948 it became clear that there was no realistic chance of reuniting the western and eastern parts of Germany. In the middle of that year, the first critical phase of the Cold War became reality with the introduction of separate currencies, the signing of the Frankfurt Documents, which were the formal recommendation of the Western Allies for the establishment of West Germany, and the Berlin Airlift, whereby the Soviets isolated West Berlin from the outside world for a period of nearly 11 months. If you want to know more about the Berlin blockade, check the video about the Berlin Airlift on this channel. In November 1955, the West German armed forces, the Bundeswehr, were founded, and not even 2 months later, in January 1956, the East German Nationale Volksarmee, NVA, the National People's Army, was established. But in fact, militarization of East Germany had already been taking place for years. In 1946, the East German border police, the Grenzpolizei, was set up. Their task was to support the Soviet army in securing and controlling the border to the west. In 1948, the number of border police officers was significantly increased, and the Kasernierte Volkspolizei, Barrack People's Police, was founded. Although they were not intended to be involved in any military action, the Kasernierte Volkspolizei, KVP for short, was in fact the next step towards a national army. The police officers were soldiers in disguise. The KVP was centrally controlled, led by former officers, and was subject to military operating rules. All these activities took place in secrecy. To be complete, also, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were still present in East Germany as well. The history of both the East German Navy and Air Force begins in 1950. In that year, the Hauptverwaltung Seepolizei, the main administration sea police, was founded, which in 1960 became the People's Navy, the Volksmarine, and the Luftpolizei, the air police, which as of 1956 was called Verwaltung Luftstreitkräfte. At the beginning of 1952, still 4 years before the official formation of the NVA, the total military staff, land, sea and air forces already amounted to 55,000 men. The official go-ahead from the Soviet Union to establish a people's army came in spring 1952. During the rest of that year, the number of staff of all military forces went up to more than 90,000 men. On June 17, 1953, it was the Soviet army that crushed the German uprising. The KVP was not brought into the field, mainly because of organizational issues. Also, the GDR leaders feared that the KVP could turn against them. The Warsaw Pact was founded in 1955, an alliance between the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia and East Germany, along with governmental and defense structure. After that, it was only a matter of getting the approval from Moscow to formally constitute the NVA by law, which finally happened in January 1956. The main part of the organization, the NVA land forces, consisted of the former KVP, the Barrack People's Police. Willi Stoph became the first Minister of National Defense, Minister für nationale Verteidigung. Land, naval and air forces of the NVA were all structured under the Ministry of National Defense. In 1960, Stoph was succeeded by the experienced General Heinz Hoffmann. Hoffmann would stay in his role as defense minister till his sudden death at the age of 75 in 1985. He had played a key role in the development of the NVA. Hoffmann was also the man behind the Schießbefehl, the order to shoot people that were trying to escape from the GDR, announced in October 1961, shortly after the Berlin Wall was built. A significant part of the military personnel had formerly served in the Wehrmacht during the Second World War, which was no different in West Germany, by the way. In 1948, 5,000 German prisoners of war were made available by the Soviet Union to become part of the KVP. In many cases, these men had signed up under pressure. Between 1957 and 1959, around 300 former officers with a Nazi background were discharged. An important reason was the propaganda value of this denazification, whereby the GDR wanted to show that they were doing better than the West German army that was led by former Nazi generals. Nevertheless, in the NVA there were still many links with the former Wehrmacht. Army barracks, weapons, pieces of equipment and training material had just been taken over. Also, the NVA uniforms were an interesting item. Where the KVP officers in the 1950s still had khaki uniforms in Russian style, the grey uniforms introduced as of 1956 revived associations with the former Wehrmacht uniforms. The NVA was not operating independently. Its forces were organized to function as an addition to the Soviet troops in Central Europe. The military commanders had to implement Soviet requirements. The presence of dozens of Soviet advisors during the first 2 years of the existence of the NVA made sure that the new East German forces would develop in the right direction. And also thereafter, for all essential decisions, the GDR needed to get approval from its big brother first. In the night of August 13, 1961, the border around West Berlin was closed, and in the weeks that followed, the Berlin Wall was built. Thousands of NVA soldiers were used to secure the border strip until it was fully sealed. 1 month later, the border police became part of the NVA and was renamed Kommando Grenze, Border Command. They were later renamed again as Grenztruppen der DDR, the border troops of the GDR. In 1961, they were made up of around 36,000 men. 1 year later, the border troops had already 52,000 men. As of 1973, the Grenztruppen were not part of the NVA organization anymore, but still reported to the Ministry of National Defense. Initially, recruitment to the NVA was based on a so-called voluntary system. The majority of the young East German men, however, were not keen to do military service. The state tried to increase the political and moral pressure, but the results were unsatisfactory. In January 1962, the GDR introduced 18 months of compulsory military service for all men between 18 and 50 years old. For the sake of completeness, I'd like to mention that introduction of the military service in West Germany had happened in 1956, related to their accession to NATO 1 year before. Under pressure from the churches, the option of unarmed military service in the NVA was introduced in the end of 1964. In the 1960s, the NVA developed into full coalition forces of the Warsaw Pact. During those years, the GDR took part in several maneuvers in which tens of thousands of soldiers from the Warsaw Pact participated. In these military exercises, the NVA frequently had a leading role. After their state of combat readiness during the closure of the border around West Berlin, 1 year later, in October 1962, the NVA was again placed on alert because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union had stationed nuclear weapons in Cuba in reaction to the placement of nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey by the US. Luckily, it didn't come to a war. The Soviet Union and the United States both agreed to remove their missiles. In 1968, in Czechoslovakia, a reform of socialism was initiated with strong support from the population. The changes were seen as too democratic by the Soviets, which resulted in a military intervention by Warsaw Pact armies in August that year. During the invasion, which put an end to the Prague Spring, dozens of people were killed. 3 months later, the East German newspapers reported that thousands of people took to the streets to welcome back the NVA soldiers from Czechoslovakia. But this was merely propaganda. East Germany didn't actively participate in crushing the Prague Spring, apart from some soldiers from the NVA intelligence corps. It was Soviet leader Brezhnev who had decided at the last minute that East Germany should not participate to avoid reviving memories of the German invasion in 1938. The NVA did, however, provide logistical support to the Soviet troops, thereby contributing to the crushing of the democratic developments in Czechoslovakia. In 1971, Erich Honecker succeeded Walter Ulbricht and became the first secretary of the SED, and also Sekretär des Nationalen Verteidigungsrates, secretary of the National Defense Council. Although the 1970s and 1980s are known for the policy of détente, the Entspannungspolitik, internally it was a period of armament and militarization. The increased defense expenditure had its effect on the economic situation of the country and therefore also on the GDR citizens. In the beginning, most of the NVA's armaments and equipment came from the Soviet Union and dated from the Second World War. Over the years, the GDR was able to build up its own modest defense industry, enabling the production of ships, trucks, technical equipments and also uniforms and helmets and other equipments for the troops. The rest needed to be imported from other Warsaw Pact states, mainly from the Soviet Union. Newly introduced technical weapons in the GDR had mostly already been on the market for years. During the last decade of its existence, the total personnel of the ground forces, the air forces and the navy amounted to approximately 170,000. For comparison, the GDR had around 16.7 million inhabitants, so that was 1% of the population. A few over 40,000 had an officer rank. Restructuring and a reduction of headcount at the NVA took place in 1989, the last full year of its existence. The reasons behind that were the rapprochement between East and West, but also cost saving, given the economic situation of the GDR. Over the years, the NVA slowly but surely earned recognition from the East German population, a significant contribution coming from the military support of the people in cases of floods or severe wintry conditions. At the end of December 1978, the temperature suddenly dropped from 10 to minus 25 degrees. Due to the freeze and snow, the transportation of lignite, the main energy source of the country, came to a standstill. Complete regions, including the island of Rügen, were cut off from the outside world. Around 50,000 NVA troops provided support by removing snow, distributing food and providing medical help using helicopters. That the NVA soldiers were not an enemy of the people was proven in the end of 1989. Although the army was present and on standby during the mass demonstrations against the GDR government in October and November that year, there was no violent dispersal of the demonstrations by the NVA. At some events, soldiers even joined the people on the street. One of the reasons behind that was the increased level of dissatisfaction within the NVA. At the end of 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, with a new Minister of National Defense, the first organizational changes were brought in, making life easier for military personnel. Amongst other things, the state of constant combat readiness was abolished. A 5-day work week was introduced, and the compulsory military service was reduced from 18 to 12 months. Most importantly, the NVA was no longer to be an organization dominated by the SED, the Communist Party. But going towards German reunification in October 1990, restructuring combined with many redundancies was already well underway. To the new democratically elected government, the NVA was an institution that, as part of the ongoing international disarmament, they would rather downsize. At first, it was not clear if the NVA would continue to exist as an independent army for a couple of years. But after negotiations with the Soviet Union in mid-July, it was decided that Germany would have just one army, meaning that the NVA would be absorbed into the Bundeswehr. Added to that, with the many personal changes that had been taking place in the higher ranks, it is clear that the working atmosphere in the East German forces during the last months of their existence was not the best. In that same period, some important formalities needed to be dealt with, such as the GDR leaving the Warsaw Pact and the return of a number of sensitive arms to the Soviet Union. Of the total NVA equipment, only a small part was kept for active use by the Bundeswehr, such as the MiG-29 fighter aircraft. On October 3, 1990, the day of German reunification, approximately 90,000 NVA staff members became part of the Bundeswehr, whereas at the end of 1989 there had been around 170,000. Also, 48,000 civilian employees were taken over. The 90,000 included about 40,000 persons on compulsory military service. In the years that followed, 60% of the professional staff were made redundant. Because the NVA had had a relatively high number of officers, in those ranks the dismissal rate was higher than average. There were also a number of personnel that couldn't deal with the fact that they were now supposed to work for a former enemy. The integration of the NVA into the Bundeswehr didn't go without some problems. Many of the issues that occurred were typical of the reunification of Germany. It was far from the fusion of two equal parties. A takeover, not a merger. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, feel free to do so and click on the bell button to be informed when a new East Germany investigated video is available. You might want to check out these videos as well.